Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Alec Blennis, and this week's episode is all about strength training for runners. So whether you're a pure runner, some other kind of endurance athlete, or even a hybrid athlete, this video is for you. Most runners are going to be interested in strength training for one of three main reasons. First is going to be to improve performance directly. So here we're talking about the ability to improve running economy and efficiency, improve power to weight ratio, and those sorts of improvements that are going to translate to faster times within a relatively short period of time. The second reason is going to be some sort of injury prevention or rehabbing an existing injury. And then lastly, and a more interesting facet of gym training is going to be improving physiological resilience. So this is going to be things like improving durability, work capacity, and just the ability to tolerate more hard training over time. When it comes to strength training and running performance, we do have some good data to look at, but I also want to talk through some of the gaps and limitations of the research so don't get too far ahead of ourselves. One of the main limitations is that a lot of the research studies are relatively short term. We're generally looking at 8 to 12 week studies, sometimes 16, and looking at changes in running economy or efficiency. The second is that most of the performance data that we have when it comes to how strength training impacts time trial performances are almost all on 5K distances and less. So when it comes to strength training and its ability to improve performance at things like a half marathon, or ultra marathon, the data is very sparse, so you have to make a lot of assumptions to kind of extrapolate from some of those shorter term studies. Now, on social media, you'll see all sorts of promises about how people took their marathon time from 3:30 to sub 3 just by adding strength training, but I think that's a lot of hype compared to what we see in the actual data. Typically, we're looking at pretty small improvements, often performance improvements of 2-3% in some of these studies, which, well, it doesn't sound crazy. Even a 2 or 3% improvement is still pretty impressive, especially for some of the short-term studies that we see. Now, the question remains is when we strength train for a longer period of time, potentially months, years, or decades, are those small performance improvements going to keep accumulating, or is it just a small benefit that then we sustain across time? We don't really know for sure. I think we can make a pretty convincing argument either way, depending on the person. For a variety of reasons, I personally think that the benefits of strength training for runners is probably understated in the literature. One of the main reasons I think that is that when I look at a lot of the studies on strength training for runners, the programs are often not very well designed. In fact, many of them don't train calves at all. Calves are the most important muscle for forward propulsion, and a significant portion of the research on strength training for runners doesn't train the most important muscle. Second, a lot of the adherence to these programs is relatively poor. So if you just select for programs that have good adherence and programs that train the calves, we typically see that those performance studies have some of the best results of any strength training for runner study out there. The other reason that I think a lot of the benefits are probably understated is that a significant portion of them have to do with improvements in tendon stiffness and muscle tendon stiffness that improve running economy. We know from other tendon research that improvements in the quality and structure of a tendon takes a very, very long time. Oftentimes, things like getting over a tendinopathy can take years. And so we would reasonably expect that a lot of these tendinous adaptations are going to be things that stack up over a much longer period of time, going to be typically seen in 12 to 16 week hang studies. Now, on the other hand, there are some reasons to think that the benefits of strength training for runners might be overstated. Anecdotally, we do see that a lot of the best runners in the world don't strength train. Now, a lot of them do. It's generally increasing in popularity, but it still has to be reconciled that a lot of the best runners just don't do it. So how important could it be? We'll get into that a little bit later. The other thing to keep in mind with strength training is there's always an opportunity cost. And most studies generally look at people who stick to their program or stick to their program and add strength training. But if you have the additional time, resources, and energy to do more training, I think a more honest comparison would be to compare strength training versus additional aerobic training, or invest in your time, energy, and resources, and one of several other things. So if you are looking to add strength training to a program, be mindful of that opportunity cost. What else might you be able to do instead? Now, being aware that most people don't train full time, they have a job, families, other hobbies and responsibilities they have to attend to. One thing that I'm very passionate about is helping runners get as much as they can out of strength training in the least amount of time. I want to minimize that potential opportunity cost that we talked about so that you're not giving up potential mileage or giving up other things in life just to have another part-time job in the gym. I truly believe that you can get most of the benefits that strength training has to offer in a very small amount of time if you know what you're doing and stick to the principles I'm about to share with you. All right, before we dive in, first thing I'm going to do is a quick footwear change. Lifting in really squishy running shoes is not ideal. It's not the end of the world if you're doing, machine exercises, things that are relatively stable. It's probably not the worst thing that you could do, but especially as you get into higher stability demand exercises, free weights, single leg movements, and so on, you're going to want something that is just a little bit firmer of a sole, a little more stable. Two main options. It's going to be just like a classic kind of gym or training shoe. I got the Rad 1 V2s here, or something like really minimalist or close to barefoot. Both are solid options. The more you lift, the more you'll kind of figure out which type of shoes you like for different exercises. Some people will have, multiple pairs of footwear for a lift. If you don't care that much, just pick your favorite, pick one. I'm going to wear my Rads today. These have a little bit of a heel to them. The elevated heel feels pretty nice for some of my squats compared to the totally barefoot option, but I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. As long as you're comfortable and as long as you're stable, you're going to be good. You want something that is fairly easy to balance in if you're standing on one foot. One of the most common mistakes that I think runners make in the gym is they try to make everything too running specific. If you take something like a squat, for example, a lot of runners will look at that and say, wouldn't it be more specific if you just did that on one leg, since running takes place on one leg at a time? Then they would look at something like a set of 5 and they'd say, no, why don't you do a set of 20 or 30 reps that's higher volume, more of a muscular endurance stimulus, and running is an endurance sport. And I think you can take that dangerously far. We could start saying things like, okay, why not 100 reps or 200 reps? Why not alternate from one leg to the next? And all of a sudden we're going from one leg to the next at high speeds for hundreds of reps. And now we're just running. And so the purpose of the gym is to deliver a stimulus that you don't get from your primary sport. The gym is important specifically because it's not running. So we want our cross training, our gym training, we want it to be specific enough, but no more specific than it needs to be, because then we're completely missing the point about what gym training is supposed to be in the first place. What we can accomplish here in the gym is improving things like tendon stiffness with heavy loads that are often best accomplished with very heavy, highly stable exercises. If you try to make things too running specific or too complex, you just reduce your output and you fail to deliver the tissue level stimulus that you're trying to accomplish. So I think it's very important that we stay mindful of that general to specific relationship and that we make things specific enough that we're training the right tissues, and to some degree we're training the right joint angles or positions, but we don't take that logic too far and then try to really replicate or mimic the demands of running in the gym, because at that point you'd probably be better off just going for another run instead. Now, it's not that very sport specific or run specific exercises and programs don't work. They often just don't work for the reason that you think they do. For example, a lot of people will feel very beat up or overly tired and fatigued from just doing heavy squats and deadlifts all the time and then trying to run. And then when they switch to a more, run specific program and they start doing all sorts of these single leg exercises and functional exercises, so to speak, they feel that the running performance improves. And I think that's a real phenomenon that we have to address. A lot of people will credit the specificity of those programs for the improvement rather than the overall reduction in fatigue and training outputs. As I mentioned earlier, complexity can reduce output, and that can be for better or for worse. And a lot of times when people start doing more sport-specific work that has higher stability demands, higher coordination demands, the load that they can lift, the overall training volume that they're performing is less. And that's easier to tolerate, easier to recover from. And when you experience that reduction in fatigue, your performances will probably get better in the short term. However, that doesn't mean that we're continuing to elicit the adaptations that we care about in the long run, nor does it mean that that is the most efficient way to go about doing so. I think when we think about sport-specific lifting programs, it's really about sport-specific load management rather than super sport-specific exercises. If I'm training a runner, I'm going to have them lift with higher training volumes, higher outputs when they're further away from my competition. And as they get closer to a race day or a very high intensity training block, we're going to reduce their outputs in the gym to get that fatigue down and allow those improved performances to manifest. You could do that by increasing complexity. It's kind of what I call an idiot-proof way to do so. When you introduce more complex exercises, the outputs are going to go down. But if they have intensity discipline and are following a good program, you can reduce the volume, reduce the weights, and experience a lot of those same benefits that runners often get from doing things like balance and stability exercises. One of the reasons that I'm passionate about making the distinction between sport-specific, highly complex exercises that reduce training output versus simple, loadable exercises that deliver the tissue level adaptation that we're looking for is because I think that runners are already hesitant to spend time in the gym because they see it as a distraction, something that takes away from their run training and something that takes a lot of time. And I think that if you do things right and you know the adaptation you're trying to get and choose the exercises that are best suited to delivering that adaptation, you can get the benefits from a strength training program extremely, extremely quickly. A couple of sets per week per muscle group with the right inputs, the right intensity, and the right focus is going to go a long way. And I think most runners could do that in as little as 20 to 30-minute sessions a week. And yet I see runners with hours long gym routines, doing a lot of overly complex exercises, long drawn out warm up and mobility routines. And it's a lot of unnecessary mental strain and unnecessary time that I don't think is adding a lot to their program. So one of the most important considerations for me when talking about strength training for runners is what I call just trimming the fat. We see runners spend an inordinate amount of time in the gym for minimal actual strength gains. And I think that we can accomplish that in a lot less time if we're ruthlessly efficient with what we choose to do and what we decide is just not important enough to bother with. So first thing I want to talk about is what muscles, muscle groups, and movement patterns do we actually need to train? Now, the first muscle that we're going to talk about training is the calves, more specifically the soleus. Now, the soleus is the single most important muscle for forward propulsion in running. The glutes get a lot of hype and credit, but when it comes to long distance running, especially, the soleus really steals the show and is the single most important muscle. Now, the soleus and the gastrocs are the two main muscles of the calf. The soleus is more active when the knee is bent. The gastroc is more active when the knee is straight. Now, that has led a lot of people to do seated calf raises or other bent knee calf raise variations because they tend to isolate the soleus a little bit more. However, there's a lot of good research now that that may not be necessary. It's likely not a case of bent knee calf raises being more soleus. They just take the gastroc out. When we have a straight knee, like a standing kind of standard issue calf raise, we're probably not getting any less soleus. We're still getting plenty of soleus plus the gastroc. So in general, if I'm programming calf work for someone, I usually just program a good old fashioned standing calf raise variation. I don't have anything against the seated variation, but we see really great soleus gains from standing calf raises as well. So it's probably not necessary to specifically do some of these bent knee variations. If you have other reasons that you want to do this variation, like you find that you can get better range of motion or it feels better on your knee. Some people get some discomfort behind their knee and like their hamstring, popliteus, with some standing variations. If any of those things apply to you, that's fine. But if you don't have any other limitations and you feel good doing them, I think standing is just fine. So we're going to spend some extra time talking about calves today because a lot of the principles that we talk about with this muscle group are going to apply equally well to a lot of the other muscle groups that we want to train as a runner. The first of those principles is going to be the importance of training heavy and hard and not mistaking discomfort or sensation for stimulus. So this idea of sensation versus stimulus is super, super important, especially for runners who are used to chasing the burn, chasing fatigue out on the road or on the track. When they come into the gym, we should not be looking for some of those same sensations. Strength training is about lifting heavy, creating muscular mechanical demands, creating tendon strain or tendon deformation. A lot of those things can happen without a significant burn, without things really hurting in the way that we might be used to on the run. I think the calves are a great example to kind of drive this point home, because a lot of times people will focus on really getting up on their tiptoes on every single rep of a calf raise, but we end up with something we call active insufficiency. Muscle fibers work by having overlapping fibers of actin and myosin, and that overlap is what allows the muscle to contract. When a muscle is fully contracted, we don't have a lot of overlap anymore. It's like two Velcro pieces that are barely stuck to each other. They can't really pull on each other very hard or create much additional contraction. At the top of a calf raise, that active insufficiency is an area where we lose that overlap and we lose the ability to create force. However, despite there being very little force produced, we can get a very intense burning sensation and cramp-like sensation that feels really, really tough. In fact, a lot of calf exercises where we are in that active insufficiency range, where we're getting to that point where it just wants to cramp and seize up, but we barely have any weight on it. Those are some of the most painful, challenging exercises out there. But in terms of what those exercises do for calf strength, for Achilles tendon stiffness, and the adaptations that are actually going to translate to improved running speed, power, and running economy, those exercises are just not going to cut it. So my main advice when it comes to training calves and other muscle groups is stop chasing sensation, rely on underlying principles. What is going to drive the adaptations that we care about? And that's going to be things like maximizing overall mechanical load, maximizing tendon strain or deformation, and in a lot of cases, just picking exercises that actually allow us to move a substantial amount of weight. A lot of exercises that you do in the gym have a natural kind of stopping or resting position on every single rep. For example, on a bicep curl, when I get to the bottom of that rep, I'm not under significant challenge or strain, and I can kind of get some blood flowing back into the muscle, do the next rep. During that rep, the muscle is contracted really hard, and blood doesn't flow very well through a contracted muscle. It occludes the blood flow. But at the bottom of each rep, fresh blood is able to get back in, flush out some metabolites, and keep things from really burning considerably, at least until I'm 15, 20 reps in. Then at that point, things will start to burn a little bit. With other exercises, though, they're just naturally a little bit more constant tension, and there's not as much of a resting position at any point during the rep. The calves are a good example of that. During a regular kind of full range of motion calf raise, there's no point during that lift where I can just hang out all day. If I'm up on my tiptoes, it's going to quickly start to burn, and I'm not going to be able to hang out here very long. Compared to that bottom position of a bicep curl, I could hang out for quite a long time before doing the next rep. What that means is that the calves in particular are going to be very sensitive to sensation from occlusion and from metabolic waste products. So if you're doing even a set of 10, 12 reps, you might end up with a decent amount of burning just because it is more of a continuous tension exercise compared to some of those other movements that you're going to be able to get a little bit more blood flowing through. On the topic of not chasing sensation and actually trying to drive stimulus, I tend to really avoid higher rep work with the calves and focus on going really, really heavy. Some exercises, I think it probably doesn't matter quite as much, but I find a lot of people just prematurely stop calf raise sets early because it burns, not because they've actually approached true mechanical failure or put a lot of load through their calf and their Achilles. With calves, if you remove some of the potential limiting factors like not doing too many reps and getting too much of a burn, not going too extreme range of motion or getting into that active insufficiency range, and also not relying on unstable exercises where balance is a limiting factor. If you get rid of all of those limiting factors, if you have something that is stable, low to moderate reps, and moderate range of motion, most people will be absolutely shocked at how strong their calves really are. Now, I'm not big on strength standards and saying you have to lift X amount of weight or you should be able to lift X amount of weight, but anecdotally, I found that most people, if you get them on a stable machine, lifting through a good range of motion, and not doing too many reps, most people that run will be able to get at least their body weight added onto a bar, if not well beyond that. So I'm going to take you through what I think a good set of calf training looks like, and then we'll move on to some other topics from there. I find that on calf raises specifically, just getting up to about neutral, kind of a neutral ankle position, is really plenty. Getting much above that, you just get a lot of shortening, not a lot of myosin actin overlap, not going to be very strong in kind of those upper top half of the range. So bottom half partials, lengthened partials, whatever you want to call them, I find that calf raises are a really good candidate for that style of training in a way that a lot of other muscle groups just aren't. The other thing you'll notice is I only did about 4 or 5 reps, and realistically, that is plenty to get the type of tendon strain I want on my Achilles tendon. I could do more reps. It would potentially just add a lot of fatigue and potentially more muscle damage to my calves, soreness that I'm going to have to contend with when I go out and actually run. Now, on the note of fatigue, I do think that there's a delicate balance to be struck between avoiding unnecessary fatigue and being overly afraid of fatigue in the gym. I think that being afraid of fatigue has kept a lot of runners from training their calves in the first place. We know that the soleus is the most important muscle for forward propulsion. It's also the muscle that you're going to notice the most if you go try to run on it while it's tired. So it's natural for runners to avoid the things that are going to make their next run pretty difficult, and calves are a great example of that. If you're new to calf training, what you'll likely find is that your next run feels really bad. Your legs are going to be shot, you're not going to feel very springy in your calves and your Achilles, and it might discourage you from going on to keep calf training. But I promise it's one of those things that gets better over time, and that should really just be a testament to you about how important that muscle is. Imagine if it was that much stronger and more prepared, and that's what this is going to do for you over time. You just have to stick with it and be consistent. Keeping a relatively low training volume, just a couple of working sets, 4, 5, 6 reps. I want to be clear, the exact number doesn't matter. Just keep it reasonable so you're not chasing that burn and chasing that fatigue. And then make sure you're going heavy. Don't stress about the exact range of motion. Try to get a decent stretch at the bottom. Come up about halfway or 2/3 of the way up. Just don't overemphasize really getting up on your toes, or I think you're going to hold yourself back in terms of overall load. Those are the most important things to keep in mind with calf training. The exact setup and machine, whether it's a Smith machine, doing them on a leg press or a dedicated calf machine, I don't think all that stuff really matters that much as long as you're just training your calves at all. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind on the fatigue side of things. If you are in a more general training phase where fatigue is less important, you might have just an easy long run tomorrow. If you go into it a little bit more sore or tired, that's okay. In a phase like that, you might try some more aggressive volumes, maybe push the reps a little higher, the sets a little bit higher, or do even some eccentric overload work where you lift a heavy weight with 2 legs and then slowly come down on 1 leg. That sort of stuff can cause a lot of muscle damage and soreness, and that might be more appropriate to do in the context where the immediate cost of fatigue is not as high. That general training before easy runs and so on. When you get into a higher intensity training block, you're getting close to a race, or maybe you even have a race that week or that month, keeping fatigue lower is going to be a little bit more important. That's where a couple of strategies can become very useful. One is isometric training. You can still get a lot of the tendon strain and tendon adaptations without the muscle fatigue and without the muscle damage. You can also get some of that from more concentric oriented training. So training where you really only are lifting the weight up and you don't have to do a lot in terms of controlling the weight down. Couple ways that you can do both of those. I'm going to show you on the Smith machine. Keep in mind, you can apply some of these concepts to any exercise or muscle group, but I find keeping some of these fatigue management strategies in mind for the calves specifically is extra important just because they are so critical. So this is going to be a quick review of concentric bias training, eccentric bias training, and isometric training as it pertains to the calf raise and when you would want to use each in your training. Now, the first is going to be the most damaging and generally the most fatiguing, and that is the eccentric overload calf raise. This is where you're going to lift a weight with usually both legs and then lower it with control with one. This is going to allow you to get more weight on the bar or on the machine than you would ordinarily be able to lift. Now, this is important because a lot of people will just kind of go through the motions with eccentric work. And if you're not lifting more weight than you could usually do with a normal training style, you're kind of missing the point of what eccentric overload is all about. As a general rule of thumb, I like to see people lifting at least 20 to 30% more than their 1 rep max. So if you think about how much weight could you lift with a single leg calf raise for just 1 rep, you should be doing at least a little bit more than that for these controlled eccentric only reps. So generally all it's going to be is lifting the weight with 2 legs and then trying to control and fight a controlled lowering portion with 1, lifting it again with 2 so that that part's not stressful, and then you're really overloading or challenging yourself on that controlled return with 1 leg. Now, ideally, you're going to pick a load that you can control to some degree, but it shouldn't be easy. It shouldn't feel like a weight that you could lift back up or pause. You should be kind of losing the battle, so to speak. And as you fatigue through the set, that lowering phase or that eccentric might get faster and faster as you start to get closer to failure. Once you're not able to control it for at least a second or two, that's about where I would usually call that set. Now, this kind of work, because it is so heavy, it's heavier than 1 rep max, you're going to be able to get a lot of strain on the tendon. So you're going to get a lot of tendon stiffness adaptations from this type of work. The potential downside is that because it's an eccentric lengthening contraction, you get a lot of muscle damage, a lot of fatigue, a lot of soreness potentially from this type of training. A lot of people consider that a downside, but I do think that there's some structural adaptations that take place from that sort of work, especially when it comes to a molecule called titin. With that sort of contraction, you just have to be mindful of how you're placing it in the context of a training week, a training month, or a training year. You don't want to place stuff like that before really hard, high intensity workouts. You don't want to do it in competition season or anything like that. But I do think that it is going to give you some damage resilience, and you're going to be able to tolerate more volume of repeated eccentric contraction or more impact from long duration running because of this type of work. So I would generally do this in a more general phase if you're going to do it at all, or just stick to regular calf training. That'd be fine too. But just be aware that this is an option. The opposite of this is going to be a concentric bias calf raise. So rather than going up with 2 legs and down with 1, making the lowering portion harder, the concentric version is going to be lifting with 1 that's very, very tough, and then using both legs to come back down to essentially eliminate or severely reduce the demands on the eccentric component. It's going to look something like this. I'm going to lift a tough weight. It's going to be very challenging to lift with 1 leg. I'm going to use both legs to return back to the bottom. Tough lift with 1 leg. Use both to return back to the bottom. Now, this is not something that people will do super often, but I think it's probably underutilized, and there's some other ways we can use this sort of concentric bias approach with other lifts. The main reason for this, that you would do something like this, is the opposite of the eccentric overload work, and that is that it's the least fatiguing and causes the least amount of muscle damage. It's not that heavy. It's well within or well below your potential 1 rep max, and we don't have much eccentric loading to worry about, but we're still creating relatively high forces. We're still training that concentric component. It's going to be generally enough to maintain muscle hypertrophy and strength. You're going to get some tendon adaptations from it, and you're not going to be very tired from it like you would from a really heavy eccentric. This works well if you know that you have, say, a tougher workout tomorrow. If you have a lot of tougher workouts starting to accumulate in your training program in a more specific training block, you might consider experimenting with some more concentric bias work just because it's so much easier to recover from. Now, in between those two, we have just pure isometric work. where you're just holding the weight still. With the isometric hold, you're going to be able to lift or hold very heavy loads, generally heavier than you can handle with that concentric load. Um, Not technically as heavy as you might be able to get away with on eccentric only, but still very, very heavy. And because there's not a lot of muscular fatigue or muscle damage associated with this, you can accumulate a lot of time and a lot of volume with a lot of load on the tendon. So this tends to be one of the highest demand exercises on the tendon. I think that can be a good thing and a bad thing. A lot of times when people are injured or kind of rehabbing, they'll default to isometrics because they're a little bit easier to recover from muscularly. But sometimes we don't appreciate how much load these can impart on the tendon. And so even with isometrics, I encourage people to ramp into them gradually, see how the body responds and adapts to it. Because long term, you're going to be able to lift some really serious load on this. I like to use both feet to at least get this started and then gradually offload onto the one rather than being a sudden drop. You're going to hold anywhere from 5 seconds up to maybe even a minute in some cases, but usually I'll do 5 to 10-second holds. And then I encourage a gradual kind of offloading, maybe use that other foot and then lower it slowly and come out of it. What you generally want to avoid on this stuff is a really rapid kind of jerk into it and a sudden offloading. That can be a little bit irritating at times. So just kind of ease in and ease out and you'll be okay. What I really like about isometrics for calf raises is, like I mentioned earlier, because the calves are so important for running, when they are unusually tired from the gym, it can have a severe consequence on the quality of your run that day. But we do want to keep training them and at least do what we can to maintain some of the tendon stiffness qualities, maintain some of the strength qualities of the calves, even when we're running really hard. So how I'll generally periodize this in someone's program is I'll use more traditional calf training, full range of motion training or lengthened partials when they're in a more general training block. And then as we get into more race specific work or within 8 to 12 weeks of a race, I'll phase some of that stuff out and rely a little bit more heavily on isometric work or maybe some of that concentric bias work. It's also a helpful tool to have in their toolbox if someone does have any sort of like Achilles tendon flare-ups, anything like that that might start reducing their training quality. You can always reduce some of the stress on someone's calves and insert some isometrics to really load that tendon without a lot of additional fatigue. So far, we've talked a lot about tendon stiffness. So I'm going to clarify a couple of points about that and then talk about some other things that are equally important. When it comes to tendon stiffness, the primary driver for improving tendon stiffness, which is going to translate to improved running economy and energy return, is tendon strain, or how much we're able to deform and stretch that tendon throughout an exercise. What's important there is being able to lift heavy enough. Now, we see a lot of individual variability in terms of how heavy we really have to lift to get the tendon strain that we're looking for. A lot of research suggests that we want the tendon to stretch at least 4.5 to 6% to be able to stimulate adaptations to that stiffness quality. Now, when we look at what sort of load in terms of percentage of 1 rep max is necessary to get that level of elongation or strain, it can vary quite a bit. Some people will get sufficient tendon stimulus from relatively light loads, like 60 to 70% of 1 rep max, while other people need to be lifting very, very heavy. On average, we generally want to see people lifting, 8 rep max, 10 rep max, relatively challenging loads as opposed to lightweight sets of 20, 30, and so on that a lot of runners often gravitate towards because they are endurance athletes and good at chasing and dealing with that fatigue. We don't necessarily need to say, nor can we say, that you have to do sets of 3 or you have to do sets of 5. It's very likely that continuing to progress strength at a set of 8 or a set of 10 is probably going to do great things for your tendon stiffness long term, but erring on that lower end, sets of 3, 5, 6 is definitely going to give us those tendon adaptations and probably keep fatigue to a minimum. But as far as an exact number of reps, we can't really say. There's a lot of individual variation. What's important is that you gradually ease into some of those heavier loads over time and see how you feel, because if you overshoot and you do too much volume of too heavy of lifting, you can overstimulate and overstress the tendon and run into some issues. So adjust your training program based on how you feel. If your tendons are responding well, you're doing great. You can continue to try to lift a little bit heavier. If you get some irritation, you might need to back off and do a little bit less. Those isometrics that we've been talking about are great for getting you the most amount of load and being able to push those tendons really hard. Just be mindful, as with anything that we talk about in these videos, be mindful of doing too much too soon. Now, tendon stiffness is not the only thing that matters. Ideally, we want the tendon and the muscle to be stiff and working as a unit together. When you're running and your foot hits the ground, not only does your Achilles tendon need to stiffen up, but your calf does as well. Now, muscle stiffness and tendon stiffness are not the same thing and not necessarily trained equally well by the same thing. Tendon stiffness is developed really well through just general heavy lifting and potentially to an even greater degree, heavy isometric training. Muscle stiffness, on the other hand, is more about rate of force production. So when that foot hits the ground, how quickly can the muscles contract to pull on that tendon as quickly as possible? That rate of force production can come from a couple of things, but plyometric training is one of the best ways to address that quality. Plyometrics for the calves can be as simple as a basic pogo hop, just jumping up and down in place like that. And plyometrics can scale in intensity and complexity from there. But the key factor there is that we're focusing on limiting our time on the ground, reducing that ground contact time, trying to be as explosive and quick off the ground as possible. That's what's going to move the needle for you the most in terms of rate of force production for some of those muscles, and contribute to that overall muscle tendon unit stiffness, getting them working together really, really well. We want to see the combination of both heavy strength training for tendon stiffness and faster, more explosive work for rate of force production for the muscles. Now, there's not a clean break between the two. It's not that this exercise does this and this exercise does that. Both qualities exist essentially on a continuum, and you're going to get some adaptation to both things from really any training that you're going to do. What matters is that we have some training across the full spectrum, from faster, more explosive exercises all the way to heavier or potentially isometric exercises. It doesn't have to be a super clean dichotomy of only super fast and only super heavy. You can explore kind of that full curve. However, I think a lot of people will overemphasize a midpoint on the curve that we call power training. For any exercise, take a basic movement pattern like a squat. I can squat at a range of speeds and forces. I can have more speed focused efforts. If I lower the weight, I can move really, really fast, but the actual force production is not going to be as high. An example of that is going to be this band assisted squat. Very low load, probably, only lifting 50 to 70% of my body weight here, but I can jump quite high. That is what we would call more of a speed focused or velocity focused version of the squat. On the other extreme, I could load up a lot of weight, squat really heavy, and move very slow, but I'd be producing a lot of force. So we have that velocity focused side of the spectrum, and we have more of that force focused side of the spectrum or the curve. Now in the middle, we can find kind of a happy medium where I can lift a moderate amount of weight moderately fast. That is what we refer to as power. The exact kind of weight percentage that's going to result in the greatest power output can vary quite a bit, but often lifting like 30, 40% of your 1 rep max as fast as you can is going to generate some of the highest actual power outputs in terms of wattage. Now, the thing with power, the argument that people have online is power something you can train directly, or is it just the result of training your speed and training your force? If you train to be very, very fast and you train to be very, very strong, chances are if you put a moderate amount of weight on the bar, you're going to be able to move it with a lot of power. Can the same thing be said in the opposite direction? For example, if you train power by training with moderate weights at moderate speeds, training at high power outputs, is that going to make you faster? And is it going to make you stronger? Probably not nearly to the same degree. In my opinion, this is why power should be called an emergent property. It's not really a fundamental quality that we can train directly. It's something that arises from the development of uh, more independent supportive factors like velocity, like force. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't train it at all or that we can't train it at all. And there's potentially some unique benefits to doing so, but I think it's significantly overrated. I would say that for the most part, a lot of power focused exercises, when we improve at those, it's because we are training the other two sides simultaneously, but possibly not as well as if we did them independently. And we're seeing some neurological or skill gains at that power based exercise. From a specificity standpoint, if you want to be good at the power exercise or want to be good at something very similar to it, for example, you're training to be a good Olympic weightlifter, a very high power sport, you might want to do some power training, not because it's the ideal way to get faster or to get stronger, but because it's relatively sport specific and will improve your ability at very related tasks. Now, when it comes to runners, however, I don't think that runners need to really emphasize power training as a distinct element in their program. I think if they focus on just getting generally strong, exposure to high forces, heavy, slow lifting, that's going to be really good for the tendon stiffness adaptations, muscular adaptations, and then have some very high velocity training like plyometrics and jumps, things like that. They're going to be very good for rate of force production and improving coordination for velocity. I think that runners can focus on those two kind of extreme ends of the curve rather than feeling like they really need to surf the entire thing or spend a lot of time on that power development in the middle. So far, we've talked a lot about training calves as it relates to strength training and speed through plyometrics. We're going to talk more about plyometrics a little bit later on, but for now, we're going to move on to strength and talk about all of the muscles, positions, and movement patterns that are important for runners. I'm going to share some of my favorite exercise variations and talk about some special considerations for technique and periodization that are going to be especially important for runners trying to program these exercises around their run workouts. The next exercise pattern that we're going to go through today is the squat. Now, most people, when they think of squats, they think of barbell back squats. But I do want to point out that, especially for a runner who's not competing in strength sports, they really don't need to be married to any particular exercise variation. So whether you like back squats or front squats or searcher squats, machine squats, or even if you don't like squats at all and you'd rather do single leg variations like split squats and lunges, I think that's generally okay. So I'm going to focus on some of the big picture principles in terms of how we're going to go about programming more of those knee extension dominant exercises, deep knee bends, if you will, anything where we're primarily bending at the knee without bending a ton at the hip. So things where we're not really sheeting our hips back, anything like that. We're going to put that in the squat category. So that could include squats with the barbell. It could include exercises like split squats, potentially lunges. As long as it's a more quad dominant exercise, we're going to lump it into this category. Now, a lot of times when runners think of squat exercises, split squat exercises, they get really position specific in terms of thinking about the specific positions in joint angles, single leg versus two legs. They think of all those things as it relates to running. And I think there's some value there, but I think it's often overstated. For example, there's a series of popular studies that looks at full range of motion back squats versus a more sport specific quarter squat or half squat. A lot of these studies find that more sport specific squat range of motion, just doing a half squat or a quarter squat, often outperforms full range of motion squats for a variety of athletic performance measures. However, what's often not talked about in those studies is that the full range of motion squat is just harder and more fatiguing. So oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier in the video, some of those more sport specific variations are just not as hiring in general, and they're going to improve your performance because you just don't have as much background fatigue. If we're careful about how we manage overall fatigue and training load, I think you can make a wide range of exercise variations work similarly well. We just have to be mindful of how fatigued we're getting and how much volume we're doing. For example, if I have a runner who is very proficient at squats, they're training through a full range of motion on a very stable machine where they can push really, really hard. I might only prescribe 1 or 2 working sets because I think they're going to get a lot out of those sets. On the other hand, if I have a runner who has more limited mobility, skill, or confidence with the squat, maybe they only have a barbell and we're sticking to box squats or pin squats through a limited range of motion, I might program a few more sets of something like that because I know that it's more recoverable and they're going to be able to tolerate a little higher volume of those variations. I don't think that we can say that one is inherently better than the other. We just have to think about the constraints that the athlete might be dealing with, how much time they have, what their preferences are, so on and so forth. So when you do look at studies that find that lunges beat squats, for example, or quarter or half squats beat full squats in the context of athletic performance or running speed, just keep in mind that fatigue variable and the overall difficulty of the workout, rather than just thinking one exercise is potentially better than another. When it comes to technique for the squat, the fact that you're a runner and you're not competing in the squat gives you some freedom in terms of how you want to execute your squat technique. That being said, we do want to make sure that we're using exercises to train the muscles that we care about. So if I was working with a power lifter, for example, I would just want to find the squat technique that allows them to lift the most amount of weight. However, with a runner, I want to make sure that we're adjusting and coaching the squat so that we're training the quads and not potentially defaulting to training other muscle groups that are better trained with other exercises. For example, if you're a runner and I see that you really kind of hinge and pop your hips back on squats, that's not inherently bad, but it does mean that you're probably offloading those quads a little bit. And we can easily train your glutes and hamstrings with exercises like Romanian deadlifts, other hinty exercises. So when it comes to something like a squat for a runner, I may be more likely to use constraints like a heel lift to really get those knees forward, keep the torso more upright, to make that squat a little bit more squatty, or hop onto some sort of supported machine like a hack squat, a Smith machine squat, something that makes it very easy to get into the muscle groups that we care about. Now, if you do potentially push those hips back a little bit more, have a hingier squat, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It's not inherently bad to train your squat that way. But if we default to that same movement strategy for everything in your training, we have a hingy squat, a hingy hinge, and you're just relying on glutes and hamstrings for everything, we are going to potentially have a weak link that could hold you back. So when it comes to runners who aren't competing in the gym, I do want to see those movement patterns generally done in a way that targets the muscle groups they work the best. I want the squats to be pretty squatty. I want the hinges to be pretty hingy. And I make sure we have a pretty good balance of hitting all those muscle groups. So I'm a big fan of machines, constraints, modifying the list however you need to make those squats look at least somewhat upright. But I think there's a wide range of what can work, and your squat doesn't have to look exactly like someone else's, as long as you feel like your quads are your main limiting factor. If you're a runner training in a fairly minimally equipped gym, just with some free weights, you might find that you struggle to hit full range of motion back squats without some sort of modification or subbing in a unilateral variation in its place. I think that's fine. I think there is a danger in thinking that unilateral variations like lunges and split squats are always better for runners because they're on one leg, but they can be useful just because they bypass some of the mobility and skill constraints that are often part of those bilateral lifts, especially when it comes to runners who maybe have shorter torso, longer legs. If they're more built to run, they often will struggle with squats in particular, and generally really want to kind of hinge those movements, pop their hips back. So I do recommend, if you're a runner, try to get on a machine if you can, try to elevate your heels if you can. And if all else fails, there's nothing wrong with doing split squats or lunges instead. Just find something that allows you to target those quads. The exact exercise is not going to make or break your running results. To reiterate a very important point, I think runners need to understand that training in the gym is not about chasing fatigue. It's about delivering the stimulus that you need to the tissue. What that means in terms of squats, deadlifts, any of the exercises we're not going to talk about today is you need to lift relatively heavy to deliver the stimulus that we want. Don't just do sets of 20 and 30 trying to get tired, but do heavy sets of 3, 5, 6, etc., to deliver a really good stimulus to the working muscle groups. Squats are no different. Generally going to be looking for a couple of working sets of anywhere from 4 to 8 reps most of the time. Like I mentioned before, when you do replace some of your classic heavy full range of motion lifts for things that look a little bit more sport specific, some more difficult to load single leg exercises with a balance component, or modified range of motion exercises, we can see that that complexity just reduces output and you're going to be less fatigued and probably see your running performance improve in the short term. However, there's other load management strategies that we can implement to make our training program running specific and allow some of that fatigue to dissipate prior to our most important workouts and most important events. For example, instead of modifying squats to be partial range of motion or doing less stable versions, we can do things like adjust our training volume, adjust whether we're emphasizing the eccentric or concentric portion, consider isometric variations, all sorts of changes that we can potentially make besides cutting the range of motion and besides swapping them out for potentially inferior, less stable exercises. My favorite one that I'm going to show you here as it relates to the squat is just doing a box squat variation for we're removing some of that eccentric demand. So instead of having to really control and stop yourself on the way down, we're going to rely on the box to stop ourselves a little bit more. That's going to put a little more demand on the concentric or lifting portion, but that lowering portion is going to be a little bit easier because we have that assistance from the box. So I want to emphasize that box squats are not inherently a better exercise or a better squat variation for runners, but they will probably make you a little bit less sore. So I'll often periodize the squat program to include more traditional full range of motion squats earlier on in someone's training cycle or in a more general training phase. And as someone approaches a key race event, or maybe we have a squat day prior to a really tough workout, I might give them a variation like a box squat that is still going to deliver a good stimulus, but is going to be just a little bit easier to recover from a muscular perspective. So that idea of making the exercise a little bit more concentric focused, reducing the demand of the eccentric portion, is something we can do with a wide range of exercises in the gym. I showed you on calves already that we could do a 1 up, 2 down variation so that the lift is toughest, lifting the weight a little bit easier on the return. You can do it with something like a box squat. If you were doing deadlifts or trap bar deadlifts, you could lift the weight and just drop from the top instead of carrying it down. And in a lot of Olympic lift variations, you can easily do something like a power clean, drop from the top, reset, pull again from the bottom. All of those exercise variations are going to be what we call concentric focus or concentric bias exercises with a reduced or minimal eccentric component. To reiterate, they're not better exercises, but they are a little bit less fatiguing from a muscle damage perspective. So they fit really well before hard workouts and during very intense race prep phases. So squats are a great quad exercise for runners, but they are an incomplete quad exercise and that they don't train the rectus femoris or rec fem for short very well. Most of your quad muscles only cross the knee joint, which means as long as your knee is bending and extending, you're going to be working those vasti muscles. Your VMO muscle is this one right here. Your VL muscle is this one right here. Those muscles are going to work just fine, whether you're doing a split squat, a lunge, a regular squat. Anytime your knee is bending and extending, those muscles get a good stimulus. But that center quad muscle, the one that runs right here, not only crosses the knee, but it also crosses the hip. And so during a regular squat, we're lengthening that muscle at the knee, but we're shortening that muscle at the hip as we go into that hip flexion, which means that the rec fem doesn't really change length or experience much tension during traditional squat exercises. However, it is a very important muscle for running, especially faster pace running and uphill running. It contributes meaningfully to that swing phase and then also serves as an important knee stabilizer at ground contact. So we do want to have a strong rec fem as runners, and squats alone, split squats alone, are not going to cut it. We want some sort of more isolated knee extension exercise where we get to work the quads without shortening at the hip. That could be a leg extension machine. That's the most common way to train that muscle. But if you don't have access to a leg extension, you can do some body weight variations, things like a reverse Nordic exercise or a sissy squat version. So I'm going to spend the next couple minutes taking you through those body weight variations, just in case you don't have a leg extension machine available. The first body weight version of a leg extension is the reverse Nordic exercise. Now, these are a great exercise because they're very simple. You can take them with you just about anywhere. But there's a few things I don't love about them. First is they can be very difficult for beginners. So you may want some sort of band assistance. But especially when you start adding some of that band assistance, you end up with an exercise that is very, very easy through most of the range of motion. And it's really very difficult, or has a very concentrated difficulty just kind of at the very back of the rep. And as soon as you get up just a little bit, it's no longer challenging. I think the other exercises provide a more balanced resistance curve, or they're more challenging through a larger portion of the range of motion, which all else being equal, I think is generally preferable. The other thing with this exercise is if you're more advanced and you want to add weight to it, you can end up just not being able to perform the exercise without literally falling over backwards. If I add significant weight to this, eventually I'll just tip over just because I have more weight on that side of my feet than on this side of my feet. Not a bad exercise. It is very simple, pretty easy to perform most places, but it's not my favorite. I usually prefer sissy squats. I like sissy squats because they're, I think, more scalable to a wide range of abilities. You can make them extremely, extremely easy, and you can make them extremely, extremely hard without running into any sort of constraints or limitations in terms of just the physics of the exercise or potentially falling over, anything like that. To make them very easy, you're just going to want a band or potentially a cable machine to provide some assistance. And hold on to that band here. And then the goal is to keep your hips completely extended. So I like to think of squeezing my glutes kind of like I'm doing a hip thrust, and just maintain that hip extension the whole time as you start to bend your knees. And we're going to use the assistance from the band like so. I'm going to lean back a little bit, squeezing my glutes. Just like that. Again, a regular leg extension machine works great for training that rec fem, but if you don't have one available and you still want some sort of isolated knee extension exercise, that assisted sissy squat is a great option. If you don't need the full assistance of a band, you can always just hold on to something like the racked barbell, hold on to the rack itself, something like that, just for a little bit of balance and stability. If you're more advanced, you can always add weight. There's plenty of more advanced sissy squat options that you can look at outside of this video. But when it comes to squat pattern, training the quads as a runner, I think having some sort of squat, split squat, leg press, lunge, one of those exercise variations to target the vasti muscles or the majority of the quads is important. And then having some secondary exercise to target more isolated knee extension. Those two exercises or exercise categories are going to be very important. The next major muscle group and movement pattern we're going to talk about is hinging or hip extension and the posterior chain. So anytime that we are flexing and then extending the hips, squeezing the glutes, etc., we are working the posterior chain. Generally with these exercises, these are going to be some of your strongest exercises: deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, even single leg deadlifts. You're usually going to be holding a substantial amount of weight in your hands. So I want to talk a little bit about straps. Now, if you're a serious lifter and you spend a lot of time in the gym, you're probably using straps and some other various lifting accessories already. But if gym is more of a secondary thing to you, if you are a distance runner, an accessory like a lifting strap might be a little bit foreign. It might not be something you've invested in. But I think even if the gym is secondary and is just there to serve your primary sport like running, I think investing in some straps is still well worth it. They're usually between $10 and $20, very accessible, very easy to use, and they're just going to ensure that your grip strength is not holding you back from being able to train your posterior chain effectively. Your glutes and your hamstrings should be stronger than your grip, especially if you're a runner and you're not doing a lot of serious grip training on the side. Your grip strength is not going to be able to keep up with the strength of your legs, and that's okay. I hear a lot of people say things like, they don't use straps because they want to train their grip, but I think it's a bad idea. We want the legs to be the limiting factor in these exercises. So pick up a pair of straps so that you can strap in and not be limited by your ability to hold on to the weight. Now, to keep reiterating some important points, just like with calves, just like with squats, when it comes to our heavy hip extension exercises, we want to chase that stimulus. We want things to be relatively heavy. As I've mentioned a couple times, sets of 3 to 5, 4 to 6, 5 to 8, somewhere in that general ballpark is going to be great for eliciting some of the muscular and tendinous adaptations that we want. You don't want to go chasing sets of 20, 25, 30 on this kind of stuff, or you're just going to get out of breath. You're going to get a crazy lower back pump, but you're probably not going to get the adaptation we're looking for in the glutes, hamstrings, and hips. So make sure you're loading this stuff up relatively heavy, push it hard. A couple working sets per week is going to be sufficient. Now, the main thing to talk about with hip extension exercises is going to be relative muscle length that we're working at. So are we training in more of the lengthened position or the shortened position? And then are we working on 2 legs or on 1 leg? There's going to be some important differences there when it comes to hip extension. Now, when it comes to muscle length, long muscle length training when it comes to hip extension is going to be things where the exercise is most challenging when our knee is close to our chest. So in the bottom of an exercise like this, if that's where the exercise feels the toughest, that is going to be a lengthened position exercise for hip extension. So something like a Romanian deadlift, that's going to feel the toughest there at the bottom of the rep. It's going to be easier here at the top of the rep. So we're training the glutes and the hamstrings in their lengthened position. We can also use exercises like split squats and lunges for this purpose, but the technique is going to be a little bit different than when we're focused on our quads. When we're focused on our quads, we really want to maximize knee flexion while minimizing hip flexion. So something like this for a split squat. But if we're trying to train more of our glutes, we want the opposite. We want more hip flexion and less knee flexion. So we'd be in a position more like this. So that same exercise can be more quad focused. It's going to be more of a squat pattern, or it can be more like this, and that's going to be more of a hinge pattern. So same exercise can serve different purposes, fit in kind of a different movement pattern depending on the technique. As long as we have some hip extension exercises in your program that are training the glutes and the hamstrings in their lengthened position, that's going to be okay. What you generally miss with more of those split squat or lunge variations, even when they're relatively hingy and you're not getting a lot of knee flexion, is you do still have some knee flexion, and so you're shortening the hamstring. Here I'm getting a lot of length on my glutes, some other hip muscles like the adductors, but I'm not creating a lot of length in the hamstrings compared to more of a true hinge like a Romanian deadlift or stiff-legged deadlift where my knees are also straight. Here I'm going to be getting a lot more range of motion for the hamstrings as well. In the context of the complete training program, we want to make sure that we're having some exercises that train the quads, some exercises that train the glutes, and some exercises that train the hamstrings. What that means is you have a lot of different options available to you, but depending on which exercises you pick for different purposes, you're going to want to step back, zoom out, look at your whole training program, and make sure you haven't left anything behind. For example, if you're relying on split squat and lunge variations for glute training, you might have not hit your hamstrings hard enough compared to if you're leveraging more deadlift, stiff leg deadlift, and single leg deadlift variations in your program. If you were to do more split squats and lunges for glutes, you may want to add in an additional hinge exercise, or maybe things like a leg curl to make sure your hamstrings aren't going understimulated. On the other hand, if you're doing more hingy exercises, Romanian deadlifts, etc., to train your posterior chain, you're probably going to be okay as far as your hamstrings are concerned. Just like with squat exercises, depending on the range of motion of the exercise and the muscle length that we're training in an exercise, we can have varying amounts of soreness and potential fatigue. For example, if I do a stiff-legged deadlift where I keep my knees very, very straight, get a ton of hamstring stretch at the bottom, that's going to be a great hamstring exercise, but it can also create a lot of soreness and fatigue that might impact me in my next running workout compared to something that trains those muscles at a shorter muscle length, like a hip thrust machine or just a modified range of motion, rack pull, for example. So just picking the weight up from a higher height like this, I'm still going to be able to get some stimulus on my glutes and hamstrings, but not in as deep of a stretch. And I'm probably not going to get as sore from that variation. I think all of those exercises can be effective at varying points in your training program. But before key workouts and races, you may want to emphasize more shortened position training, not emphasize that deep stretch as much, whether that means reducing range of motion across the board or just reducing the number of sets that you do in that extreme range of motion. Typically, when I'm far from a race and I'm in a very general training phase, I'll emphasize big ranges of motion in the majority of my training. And when the workouts are getting a lot tougher, close to a race, or I'm within 6 to 8 weeks out from a race, I'll generally keep some exposure to those ranges of motion, but I won't push those sets quite as hard with as much weight. And I'll allocate a little bit more of my intensity and my volume towards more shortened position ranges of motion, rack pulls, hip thrusts, and exercises like that. Similarly, you can also experiment with concentric bias variations or isometric variations to reduce fatigue during periods of very high intensity run training. For example, with a deadlift, I can always drop it from the top and then pick it up from the ground again, drop from the top to remove or severely limit that eccentric loading and the muscle damage and inflammation that might come from that. I can also do isometric variations, things like loading up a really heavy barbell that I can't even lift and then just pulling against it in the rack as hard as I can. I'll be able to get a pretty good stimulus from that without a ton of fatigue. Now, we also have single leg variations, and I think single leg hinge variations are great for a number of reasons. I have an entire video on single leg strength training that I think is worth watching alongside this one. One of the most important benefits of single leg training is you're going to get a little bit more stimulus for some of the muscles on the outside of the hip, like the hip abductors, the glute med, etc. Another reason I like single leg training options is because they open up some new opportunities for concentric or eccentric bias that you might enjoy as a runner. Just like with the calf work, we talked about doing more concentric versions, concentric bias variations when we're trying to limit fatigue, more eccentric bias variations when we're okay with more fatigue and muscle damage. We can do similar 2 up, 1 down, or 1 up, 2 down variations with single leg deadlift options. For example, if I'm in a more general training phase and I'm okay with a little bit more soreness and muscle fatigue, I can do something like a eccentric single leg deadlift with a very heavy weight that I wouldn't ordinarily be able to lift, shift back to 2 feet to make that concentric portion easier, and then back to 1 leg for that overloaded eccentric portion. Something like that is going to be very fatiguing, possibly cause quite a bit of soreness. So I wouldn't recommend that during a very high intensity run block or close to a race. If you're trying to limit fatigue, you could do something like the opposite, where you actually lift up with 1 leg and come down with 2, or lift up with 1 leg and then drop from the top. Both of those options are going to be great for ensuring you still get a good strength stimulus without a lot of that soreness that might follow. One of the muscle groups that gets a lot of attention among runners is the hip abductors, like the glute med and the piriformis. Now, personally, I find these muscles are a little bit overrated in the context of running. When we look at the contribution of different muscle groups to forward propulsion in terms of energy, the calves or the soleus is by far the most important. Glutes and hamstrings also very important, but in terms of forward propulsion, those smaller muscles in the side of the hip are not super critical. Now, they do still experience large forces and are important for keeping the pelvis stable and where we want to in space, but it just doesn't have to be that strong. What that means is that if you're doing heavy strength training, heavy squats, deadlifts, etc., those muscles are probably relatively strong already, especially if you're incorporating a single leg variation. Any single leg strength variation, whether it's a squat, lunge, or single leg deadlift, is going to place a lot of demand on those muscles. So if you're doing that well, you probably don't have to include a dedicated accessory movement for those muscles, but it probably won't hurt either. That being said, I think a lot of runners just throw a lot of kind of junk volume, if you will, a lot of low intensity, high rep work with mini bands and the like at some of those smaller muscles versus just doing a couple heavy, hard sets. Something like a hip abduction machine like this, actually taken close to failure, is going to go a lot further for you in terms of hip abductor strength than doing hundreds of reps of a mini band abduction or sideways monster walk, anything like that. Now, it is relatively common for runners to end up with some pain in that area, whether it's a glute med tendinopathy or hip bursitis, something like that. Having some lateral hip pain is relatively a common experience for runners. And so jumping right into something super, super heavy like this may not feel great right away. If you're having issues, I always advise talking to a qualified PT, therapist about your plan moving forward. But what I find is that with a lot of runners, just gradual exposure into something like this, start light and get heavier over time, or consider some isometric variations where you just push out and hold for a long time. Sometimes that is good at getting some of the adaptations that we want without some of the irritation that might be provocative with a pre-existing issue. The last main muscle group or movement pattern we're going to talk about as it relates to running is general core strength. Now, this is an interesting one because we have a lot of studies that look at things like core strength interventions and how they can improve running performance and running economy. So it seems pretty clear cut, but unfortunately, it's more complicated than it looks at first glance. For example, all of these different core programs and core studies typically use very different exercise interventions. Some of them are more stability oriented variations or interventions with things like a lot of plank holds and dead bugs and bird dogs. Others will label the study as core stability impacts running performance, but when you look at the actual intervention, it included things like crunches and uh, chops and Russian twists and a wider range of core exercise than you might assume based on the study title alone. So we have a lot of different programs that all improve core strength and core performance that tend to improve running economy a little bit. But as far as what specific exercises are the most important, it's hard to say. Is it going to be actual rectus abdominis or core and trunk stiffness that's important? Is it the fact that when you do a lot of these core exercises, you're also training the hip flexors a little bit, and that's what's responsible for the improvement in the running economy? Or is it the fact that you're also training a lot of inspiratory muscles that are relevant for breathing, and maybe just doing direct inspiratory muscle training would give you the same benefit? I have a lot of questions about why some of these core interventions tend to work, but in the absence of complete certainty, I take a varied approach where I do a little bit of everything. I don't have any strong opinions on the best exercise or the best core exercise for runners. I just think we should train the core variably, touch on a couple different movement patterns, and await further research. When it comes to core training, I have a whole video on training trunk flexion, rotation, and lateral flexion. If I were you as a runner, I would pick one or two of your favorite exercises across those categories, do a couple sets per week, and then move on. I don't think it's worth dedicating some of the extensive time blocks that some of these programs do to core work. You don't need a 30-minute core routine. You don't have to do an hour or 2 hours of core per week. Do a couple of tough sets of a couple of these different movements that I've shared in other videos and move on. I think that's going to be sufficient for improving running economy as far as I can tell right now. So for a quick review of what we've talked about so far, I want to show you some example programming that I would do for a runner in different phases of their training. So starting from the top, we obviously know that training calves is very, very important. So I'm going to have calf training for my athlete through all of their training phases, but I'm going to manipulate what that calf training looks like depending on how close they are to a competition or how close they are to some very key high intensity workouts. If you take a look here, you can see I'm starting the workout with a Hatfield calf raise. That's just a calf raise with a lot of weight where you're holding on to something for balance or support. You could just as easily do that with a Smith machine or other calf raise machine. I'm having them do 4 sets of lengthened partials, so that bottom half of the range that we talked about. They're going to do 4 to 6 reps total, and they're going to save just 2 or 3 reps in reserve. So this is a very tough set of 4 to 6 reps, close to failure, but not completely to failure. And we have 4 total sets here. This is a moderate amount of training volume, and they're not doing it just once this week, but they have 2 sessions where they're doing 4 sets of these lengthened partial calf raises. That's 8 total sets per week of relatively hard calf training, but this is a general training phase. So having a little bit more soreness or fatigue is okay. Now, later on in their training, in a more specific phase closer to an event, we're going to modify that calf training a little bit. So now instead of full range of motion or lengthened partials, we're moving on to 5 sets of 5 to 7 second isometric holds at a 7 to 8 out of 10 effort. So it's still not really max effort, but close. 5 by 5 to 7 seconds. We're looking for 25 to 35 seconds of very high tension. And we have that twice in a training week. This is still going to be a great stimulus, but it's going to be a lot more recoverable and not cause nearly as much fatigue as the lengthened partials in the earlier block. Now, I've presented this as sort of a uh, binary option between a higher volume of lengthened partials and just the isometric work, but it's a full spectrum, and you could mix and match or do something in between depending on where your runner is at in their season. You could incorporate a blend of traditional calf training with isometric work. You could do traditional work at one point in the week and isometric training later in the week before their long run, for example. There's a lot of ways that you can play with these two variables. The most important thing is you're aware that both options are available to you. And I don't think that you need to constantly chase fatigue or fear fatigue. Just leverage it appropriately and make sure you're mindful of the other stresses in the program. The next part in their workout is going to be a little bit of core work. I don't think that core work is the most important thing for a runner, but what I generally find is that it's pretty easy to do early on in a session. It's low barrier to entry, pretty easy for people to start with early on. And then by the time they get to their main lifts, they feel pretty good and warm. So the core training portion in this first training phase, I have them doing some bent over cable twist, something for the obliques, and I also have a Swiss ball crunch, something for the rectus abdominis. 2 sets of each. I don't think it has to take a lot, especially for a runner for whom core work is not the most important thing. You could certainly do a little bit more, but I think that's generally plenty. And then as they get into more of a competition phase, things get a little bit more intense. I don't think we really need to change exactly what that core work looks like. I've just reduced the volume a little bit to pull back on total training time and total fatigue. Pretty simple. So when it comes to someone's training program, you don't just have to have one workout. You can have a workout A and a workout B that you alternate between. You could even have several workouts across several weeks. I generally, for most runners, like that workout A, workout B, pretty simple alternating approach. It allows us to have a little bit more exercise variety, but it also keeps things relatively simple. How I typically organize it for a runner who just kind of wants a minimum effective dose strength program is I have one day where we kind of prioritize a squat pattern exercise, and then some of the posterior chain stuff is more of a secondary emphasis. And then on that second day, that workout B, it's the opposite of that. So we emphasize more of a hip extension exercise or posterior chain exercise, and then some of the quad kind of anterior chain stuff, quad dominant stuff is the secondary focus on that day. So with this particular athlete on day one, so that workout A, we're emphasizing a heel elevated Smith machine squat. I've chosen this particular variation because that heel elevation allows them to really get into their quads. The Smith machine takes some of that skill and coordination out of it and allows them to push really, really hard. Because we're in a more general training phase right now, and I think that they can tolerate a little bit more fatigue and a little bit more soreness, we're doing 4 sets through a full range of motion, pushing to 2 to 3 reps in reserve. Now, I'm not doing an excessively high number of reps, just 6. It could be 5, it could be 8. The exact number is not that important, but I am pushing them relatively hard on a machine through a full range of motion for that squat exercise. Later on, when we get to that more specific training phase, the running workouts get tougher and they're closer to a race. Instead of that full range of motion machine squat, I've gone to a box squat to parallel. That box is going to stop them, take away some of that eccentric load. This is going to be a little bit easier to recover from, and I've dropped the volume as well. Now, importantly, the exact volumes and rep schemes that I've put here are not the critical piece. What matters most is the general principle of reducing training stress and increasing recoverability as running training stress increases and we get closer to a competition. In addition to the squats I have been performing on that day, I also have some additional quad accessory work for the rec fem. First day, I have that supported sissy squat. Now, sissy squats are challenging. They are a little bit more fatiguing, generally make people relatively sore. But like I said, in this more general training block, I'm not as worried about that. I've even gone a little bit higher on the rep range here, sets of 8 to 12. I think it's fine, especially since I'm just doing 2 total sets. I don't think that's going to be overly fatiguing. But as we get deeper into the season, later on with tougher workouts closer to a race, I swap those sissy squats out for a single leg wall sit. So basically a leg extension isometric, 3 sets of a 15 to 20-second hold. Still training that rec fem. That's just going to be a little bit more recoverable. They're going to be able to push some of their run specific workouts a little bit harder. For the last piece of this workout, I have them doing some sort of posterior chain accessory for the glutes and hamstrings. In this case, I've chosen a landmine RDL, so that's a single leg deadlift variation. Um, Again, it's a general training phase. I'm not too worried about soreness or fatigue, so it's a lengthened position exercise. I'm on the higher end of the rep range here, 8 to 12 reps, 2 to 3 reps in reserve. They may be a little bit sore from that initially, but again, not too concerned about that. I love that single leg variation because it is also going to get into some of those smaller muscles on the side of the hip, the abductors and external rotators that a lot of runners will go to like a hip abduction machine or a banded monster walk to achieve. I think we're going to get plenty of stimulus for those muscle groups just by pushing that single leg hinge fairly heavy. Now, later on in the season, I'm going to reduce the stress of that a little bit, and I've swapped it out for a machine hip thrust that's a little bit lower stress, trains the glutes in their more shortened position. That's going to be more recoverable, not cause as much soreness. They're probably going to feel a little bit better for their higher intensity run specific workouts at that point. For this athlete's second workout, so that B session that they're going to alternate between, we have them starting with some calf raise again, a little bit of core work again, and then getting into those main movements. This is going to be more of a hinge focused workout. So, whereas on day one, we started with a quad dominant squat pattern, here we're starting with a posterior chain focused hinge, classic Romanian deadlift, full through a full range of motion. Got 4 sets of 6, 2 to 3 reps in reserve. May get some glute and hamstring soreness from that, but that's okay. From there, I got a rec fem accessory again, some leg extension, and then another single leg pattern that's a little bit more quad dominant as well with the walking lunge. In fact, now that I look at this, I'm probably going to do the lunges first and then save that leg extension for the end. I generally like to move kind of in order from heavier to lighter and more compound to more isolated exercises uh, as a general rule of thumb. For a runner, though, to be honest, it's probably not that big of a deal one way or the other. As long as you get all the work done, I think you're going to be okay. Uh, like I said, the main movement for this day is that Romanian deadlift for 4 sets of 6. As we get deeper into the season, we're just going to want something maybe a little bit less fatiguing. So what I've done here is gone to a trap bar deadlift where they're dropping from the top. So we're just removing that eccentric component. They're going to lift the weight up, drop from the top, and pick it up again. I've also reduced the volume to 3 sets of 5, and I'm keeping a few more reps in reserve. It's going to be 3 to 4 reps in reserve. I'm also going to cue this athlete that despite there being 3 to 4 reps in the tank, I do want them to lift explosively and with max intent on every rep. So they're really trying to pull that weight off the ground as aggressively as they can, dropping from the top and then stopping while they still have some good speed left in the tank and a few reps left in the tank. That's going to be a great way for them to train their explosive strength, but not get too tired in the process, be able to prioritize some of their own workouts they have in their program at that point. The next piece I have in that workout in the more general, more fatiguing training phase is a walking lunge. If you've done walking lunges before, you know they're pretty tough. They may get you fairly sore. So this is more appropriate in that general training phase as an additional kind of glute, hip, and quad accessory. Typically, in a walking lunge, you're going to get a little bit of all of those things. And then later on, I've swapped that out for a more shortened position exercise, 45-degree hip extension. That is an exercise that is tougher in the middle portion to top portion of the rep. So you're generally not going to get quite as sore from that as you would from something like a walking lunge. Now, the last piece of that workout is that leg extension. Um, Everybody knows and loves a leg extension. But then later in the program, I've just subbed in a little more accessory hip work just to reduce the stress on the quads a little bit, give the hips a little bit more love. Generally, that hip abduction machine is relatively easy to recover from as well. Tends to be a little bit more limited in that mid range to shorten range, depending on how you execute it. But generally, you'll find that that's not a super fatiguing exercise. I think it's a good one to focus on in a more specific training block. Just lower that kind of systemic stress from the workout. Overall, you'll find that trap bar deadlifts drop from the top, 45-degree hip extension, and some accessory hip work is a very, very manageable session. Is not going to cause a lot of fatigue or soreness. You're going to be able to turn around from a session like that and still hit a very good quality run later that day, the next day, or whenever that next hard workout pops up on your schedule. Now, I don't want you to look at this example program and think this is the way to program for runners. I'm just giving you a few simple examples of how I've implemented the principles that we talked about today, but there are infinite exercises to choose from, lots of ways that you can implement the strategies that we talked about earlier beyond what I've shown you in this very simple example program. So feel free to get creative, try some different things out. Just be thinking as you're programming about how your exercise selection, rep schemes, and any constraints that you use, range of motion modifications, all of those things. Be mindful of how that's going to impact how fatiguing that workout is for your athlete and how much they're going to be able to prioritize all the other things that they're working on in their program. So far, we've mostly talked about traditional strength training. To quickly summarize the most important points, you want to lift heavy enough to give the adaptations we want to tendon stiffness and bone density. You're not going to get those adaptations by chasing fatigue and doing unnecessarily high training volumes. Importantly, there are no must-do exercises, and you don't have to worry about making your gym training hyper specific to running. You don't have to have exercises that look exactly like gait. As long as you're getting the right amount of mechanical tension across key areas like the Achilles tendon, patellar, glute, and hamstring tendon, you're going to be doing just fine. Debates like single leg training versus bilateral training, free weights versus machines, all of those conversations kind of miss the forest for the trees because getting mechanical tension through those key areas is not that complicated. Rather than choosing exercises based on how specific they are to running, what you want to keep in mind is just overall load and fatigue management. You can adjust variables like exercise selection, range of motion, concentric versus eccentric bias, and overall training volume to manage fatigue and make sure that someone can prioritize their running workouts when they need to in high intensity focused phases and near a competition. And you can allow that fatigue to be a little bit higher when training is more general and they're not as close to a key event. Now, with strength training fundamentals out of the way, let's dive into something perhaps a little bit more controversial, and that is plyometrics. If you ask some people, strength training is important for runners, but plyometric training is where the magic really happens. Now, maybe it's a controversial take, but I think that plyometric training may be a little bit over-indexed at this point. I'm not saying it's not important, and I definitely prescribe it for my athletes, but with the popularity I've seen on social media these days and everyone looking to train like an athlete and emphasizing the importance of plyometric training, I think the pendulum might have swung a little bit too far. And I'm going to make a case over the next couple of minutes for why I think plyos are valuable, but they don't have to be that complicated. You probably don't have to do that much of them. And some of the research that looks at why plyometric training is beneficial might be kind of biased or stacked to favor plyometric training from the beginning with how the studies are designed and controlled. First, when it comes to plyometric training, I think it's important to zoom out and think about what are we really doing with things like plyos. Personally, I think of plyometrics under the big umbrella category of just very high intensity ground contacts. I think you can get that a lot of ways, whether you're sprinting, dropping off a box, doing pogo jumps, anything like that. Those are all ways to get those high intensity ground contacts and larger impulses, bigger impacts than you're going to get during your normal run training. Whether you get that from doing sprint training, flat sprints, hill sprints, resisted sprints, just submaximal strides at like mile race pace and that kind of thing, whether you're getting those impacts from stuff like that or dedicated plyos in a gym setting, I don't think is going to be as significant as people might make it out to be. In fact, we have some pretty good studies to back this up. There are studies that compare sprint training interventions versus plyometric training interventions. And when we make that head-to-head comparison, we do see that they both get great results. Unfortunately, a lot of plyometric training interventions don't report the actual run program details very well. For example, we'll see a study that says this is a plyometric training intervention on recreationally trained athletes or highly trained athletes, whatever it is, and it will just say something like the athletes stuck to their normal running program during the intervention. It doesn't tell us any information about whether these athletes were doing sprint work as part of their programming, whether they were doing strides as part of their programming. We simply don't know. And it's possible that in athletes who were including some of that typical neuromuscular work, if they were doing strides, sprints, etc., that the plyometric work might not have had as much added benefit compared to athletes who were just doing long, slow distance training, threshold work, etc. If you take an athlete like that and add some of those high intensity contacts, you're going to see some good results. And so, what I would like to see in future research is better controlling for the run programming itself. Do we have some of the sprint training, the stride training, those sorts of things that are staples in a lot of advanced runners program that a lot of recreational athletes don't include as often. I think this could partly explain why we see that plyometric interventions look so effective for recreationally trained athletes, but we tend to not see very robust effects in highly trained individuals. We don't always see great results in terms of improvements in running economy in really well trained runners. If we do, it's usually relatively minor. I do want to dig into one particular study, though, the Saunders et al. Study. It has some of the best results that we've seen in highly trained runners. These are athletes that had a VO2 max of about 71 on average, so very well trained runners. And it was a strength program and a plyometric training program that had pretty substantial improvements in running economy. So I want to dig into what they did well and why I think it worked. So, with the Saunders study and with a lot of other strength training interventions, it's remarkable how simple the strength training programs really are. The Saunders study used a back extension, a leg press, and a hamstring curl. That was it. We have a lot of very similar studies that will use just a leg press and a hamstring curl and a calf raise, or just a leg press, a hamstring curl, and some sort of squat or split squat pattern. The interventions are usually relatively minimal. Something I want to point out, though, is that a disappointing fraction of these studies actually use heavy calf training in the resistance training program. A lot of them will use something like a leg press and a hamstring curl in the strength training intervention, but neglect heavy, slow resistance training for the calves. And then that's where the plyometric training really fills the gap. The Saunders study is another example of this, where they used a leg press, a hamstring curl, and a back extension, but they didn't train the calves hard and heavy with a traditional calf raise. The only stimulus the calves were getting was in the plyometric intervention. Now, the plyo intervention was relatively simple, relatively low volume, relatively high intensity. Lots of pogo hops, single leg hops, hurdle hops, things like that. You're not going to see classic like low intensity concentric focus box jumps in a program like this. The high impact, high eccentric loading is what makes these programs so effective. Now, what I want to point out with this is that the plyometric intervention seems so impactful, I think largely because calves were not included. And a lot of the combination programs that we see work will often have strength training for the glutes, hamstrings, and the quads. But when it comes to the calves, plyos is kind of the only stimulus that we get. If we look at studies that include calf training in the strength portion and then compare heavy calf training to a plyometric program, sometimes we see that they're similarly effective. Do I think that we should still do some of both? Yes, but I think that the fact that so many plyometric training interventions don't include calf training in the strength portion kind of stacks the literature to favor the benefit from plyometric training. And if we had included calf work in the strength training already, the additive benefit from that plyo exposure would probably be a little bit less. Yes, I do still think plyos are important, but I think ultimately one of the most important drivers is just overall calf strength. In fact, this particular study I'm talking about that compared calf strength training to plyometric training found that both programs were effective, and the only variable that correlated positively with gains in running economy were gains in calf 1 rep max strength. So whether those gains came from the calf strength training program or the gains came from doing the plyometric training program, what stuck out was that the people whose calves got stronger improved their running economy the most. Overall, when we compare strength training versus plyometric training versus sprint training, we tend to see that a blended or hybrid approach works best on average. Does that mean it's going to work better for every single individual? Probably not. If you can do an in depth analysis of your athletes, figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are, I feel like you could come up with a more individualized program that addresses those weak spots more effectively than a generic blended program. But on average, I would say it's a safe bet to do a little bit of all these things. Do strength training, make sure your strength training includes work for the calves, do some general plyometric training, and do some sort of high speed, high impact running like sprints, hill sprints, or strides in your program. If you do some of all those things, I think you're going to be best off. Of course, there are athletes who probably don't need or aren't going to respond to strength training as well. And there's probably athletes that are not going to respond to some of the plyos and sprint training as well. So you can see what works best for your athletes. But when in doubt, I like the variability approach. I would consider doing a little bit of all of those things in your program. Importantly, it does not take very much, and we have to be mindful of opportunity costs here once again. If you're trying to do too many plyos, too many sprints, and you start to have a real significant fatigue or recovery cost to that, you start to feel very beat up from that, and you start sacrificing pure mileage to get some of this stuff done, that could backfire in the long run. When we look at the number of contacts, so number of high intensity ground contacts in the most effective plyometric programs, it's usually less than 100 contacts per training session. That is not very many. These are high intensity, difficult plyos, often for things like 3 sets of 10, 5 sets of 5, couple different variations across a session, usually not taking any more than about 10 minutes, 2 to 3 times per week. Oftentimes, these are added at the end of an easy run, kind of get warmed up with an easy run, and then hit some of those high intensity contacts. It doesn't have to be that difficult. Now, you can stack them and do a high intensity workout and some plyometrics. In my personal experience, I tend to feel a little bit more beat up when I combine them together, and it's harder to get the quality that I want out of those plyometrics if I'm already tired from a high intensity run. So I kind of like the microdosing approach of spreading some of those plyometric exposures out and sprint exposures out across the week, a little bit here, a little bit there, rather than trying to do too much on any one given session. And I like to stack it on the end of an otherwise easy run. I'll finish an easy run with a couple of strides or submaximal hill sprints, or in my strength training session that day, I'll include 5 to 10 minutes worth of high intensity, high quality plyometric work and call it there. These things should not be very tiring, shouldn't feel like a cardiovascular workout. It should just be 5, 10 minutes focused on getting some of those high intensity impacts and calling it there. Again, don't chase fatigue with plyo work or with sprint work. That's counterproductive. It's meant to do things that your main running workouts don't. Looking through all of the plyometric research as it relates to running performance and running economy, a couple of things stand out. So I'm going to summarize what I think are the most important points when you go to program plyometric training for yourself. First, like I mentioned earlier, make sure that you have some heavy resistant training to support the plyometric training. When we look at plyometric interventions on their own compared to plyo interventions that are paired with strength training, that hybrid approach generally works best. Make sure that you have strength training to support that plyo work that you're doing, and that includes on a muscle group by muscle group basis. And that's especially important for the calves. Make sure you have heavy training for the calves and some calf and ankle dominant plyometric movements like pogo jumps. The second most important point is to focus on plyometric work that has high impact and high eccentric demands. So things like jumping off a box as opposed to jumping onto a box. Box jumps and more concentric plyometric variations can have their place for different athletes that have different goals. But when it comes to running economy and improving that stretch shortening cycle, what you really want to see are those high impacts. So things like depth jumps and depth drops, those sorts of things are going to be more impactful than something like a straight leg box jump or something where you don't have those high impacts. The third thing that stands out is that the higher intensity, lower volume plyometric training interventions outperform the lower intensity, higher volume ones. Studies that have 100 plus impacts of low intensity plyos don't seem to be any more effective than harder studies that just have 50 to 100. So think quality over quantity, spend 5 to 10 minutes doing plyometrics that are high intensity, sets of 5 to 10. Stop when your quality starts to degrade. Don't feel like more is necessarily better because it's not. The last thing that stands out is when it comes to plyometric exercise selection, some exercises did seem to be more impactful than others. Things that are a little bit more running specific in terms of forward locomotion, horizontal movement, single leg, and bilateral hops, skips, bounds, things like that, where you're going for distance, seem to outperform things that you are going for height. You could say that there's a specificity element in terms of running as a forward, going in a straight line activity compared to going up and down. I think that it's more about the strategies being more muscle driven versus elastic and tendon driven. A lot of more vertically oriented plyometrics, like the counter movement jump, for example, tends to be a little bit slower and more muscle driven compared to when you get going, in a more locomotive plyo, a hop, a skip, a bound. Those are generally higher velocity, a little bit more tendon driven. And that's what we're looking for when it comes to translation to running economy. That is also something that is a little bit higher velocity and more tendon driven. If you apply all of those things to your plyometric training, include some strides, sprints, any sort of high intensity ground contacts, and just focus on quality over quantity, you're going to be 99% of the way there. One of the most challenging parts of doing strength training, plyometric training as a runner is just finding the time in the week and knowing how to schedule all of these things so that you can get the benefits of all of it and not just end up spinning your wheels and being too tired to get quality out of all of these sessions. Now, there's a lot of uh, kind of debate over how to optimize a training schedule, especially for people when they're trying to make progress in both. So if you're a hybrid athlete doing concurrent training and you want to see strength gains and endurance gains, there is some debate over whether you should run first or lift first or do this workout first in the week or this workout first in the week. And we'll get into all that in a second. But what I do want to make a point to emphasize is that I think that even regular runners who just care about the run performance can learn a lot from hybrid athletes because when you're a hybrid athlete and you're trying to improve both things, and you're trying to maximize quality and strength and endurance, any potential error, for example, if you're scheduling things suboptimally or inefficiently, those errors are going to be magnified by the amount of effort that you're putting into it. When you are just a runner and you don't care as much about the strength training, you may not be paying as much attention to minor fluctuations in performance and the quality of those sessions, even though they still are important for you. They're important enough that you're doing the strength sessions. You should care about what those performances are, but because it's not as important to you in terms of the actual outcomes, you're probably not as sensitive to whether you're doing some of those things optimally. I think hybrid athletes who are trying to get the best of both worlds, they're trying to push both strength and endurance very hard. They figured some things out about how to best organize some of these workouts to get the most out of both of them. And I think even a regular single sport athlete can take a lot away from that and use some of that knowledge to get a better stimulus. One of the main things that I personally try to avoid telling people is that there is one magic way to schedule these workouts. I think a lot of people will just say things like, you should always lift first. And so, you always see schedules where it's a lift and then a run, for example. You hear a lot of this kind of like overly simplistic black and white thinking. And what I've found in my experience coaching people is that everyone is different and different limiting factors and issues will come up in different people's programs depending on what they have going on in their life and what the details of some of those workouts are. For example, I'll program two athletes the same way, and one athlete will say, "Hey, I'm struggling with hamstring soreness. I'm not performing in this run session because of the subsequent gym workout." Whereas the other athlete who got the same program, they aren't dealing with that issue at all. So I have to make different changes, modify the schedule for one athlete to make that program optimal and efficient for them, where it is not as much of an issue for the other person for a wide variety of reasons. So I think rather than going into a training program and a schedule thinking this is the way, this is the optimal way to arrange a program, you have to be willing to kind of fuck around and find out a little bit and see, what is this feeling like to me? Am I getting the desired stimulus and the response that I need to get from each of these sessions? And if not, how do I troubleshoot? How do I modify? How do I stick to some big picture important principles, but also make it individualized and custom based on how I'm actually responding to the program? Overall, there's a few kind of key pitfalls that I would recommend that you avoid. But as long as you're avoiding some of those key pitfalls, I think you should experiment and explore with different arrangements throughout your career, month over month, season to season, and see kind of what those pros and cons are that arise for you. Generally speaking, I've tried a couple different main approaches, and I wouldn't say that any of them are better or worse than the other, but I've always enjoyed the changes that I've made. I found that if I program a certain way, certain workouts feel really, really great, and some workouts don't go as well. And then I change things up, and other workouts are easier to prioritize. And I think it's valuable to have some of those changes throughout a season rather than thinking you always have to program a certain way. But when it comes to those pitfalls, the one thing that I would try to avoid doing the most is trying to go into a max effort strength training session very fatigued or very depleted. So if you are going to do a heavy strength training session and a high intensity run workout on the same day, I just wouldn't try to lift immediately after that run. I would either separate the sessions out by a couple of hours, and if you do, for scheduling reasons, have to do them back to back, I would do the lifting portion first. Personally, I like to wake up and run first thing in the morning, take a couple hours, and then hit the gym after I've been able to refuel a little bit. I think that's fine. But if you do just have one training opportunity and you're going to hit strength and a tough endurance session the same day, knock that lift out first and then get on with the endurance training session. Now, I get some pushback on that point from people who care more about running than lifting because in their mind, they just want to do the thing they care about more first. And then that strength training second is more of an afterthought to them. My pushback would be if you save that strength training for afterwards, you're not going to get the stimulus that you want out of it. And it's going to take even more of it to get the same benefit than if you went into it a little bit more fresh, a little bit more focused. You could do less and care about it less and just get on with the workout that you care about a little bit more quickly and a little bit more efficiently. I'd rather see you do 15 minutes of strength and then crush that run workout, then crush the run workout, go into the strength workout tired, drag it out into 30 to 45 minutes at suboptimal quality. I don't think that that is ideal in any sense of the word. So even if you do care about running more than the lifting, if you have to consolidate into a single session, I would do that strength first because that is the stimulus that is more sensitive to being close to maximal output and having the highest training quality. A little bit of fatigue going into a run workout is not necessarily going to hurt. If anything, you can make an argument that some pre fatigue can even amplify certain endurance adaptations and certain cellular signaling. So even if you do have to go a little bit slower, I think you're still going to get the adaptations that you're looking for from those sessions. As long as you avoid that key mistake, I don't think that anything is super critical in terms of how you schedule your sessions. Instead, I would just pay attention to how you're feeling and how you're recovering. Something that I've noticed for me is that I try to avoid programming high intensity or high speed running, anything about faster anything faster than about 5K pace. I try not to schedule that immediately after a session that involves a lot of hamstring work. If I do stiff-legged deadlifts, seated hamstring curls, anything where I know my hamstrings are going to be sore, I know that I don't perform very well in like VO2 max and faster workouts for about 48 hours after that. But I can still do those workouts really well, even if my glutes and quads are sore. That's something that I've personally experienced that not all of my athletes feel the same way about. So you have to get in, try some of these things out for yourself, and see what limiting factors pop up for you. Something that a lot of runners will think about in the gym is muscular endurance. Now, muscular endurance is a complicated and nuanced topic. For the most part, I say things like muscular endurance doesn't really exist, and I'll get some pushback on that. So I'm going to explain it in as much detail as I can here. Now, muscular endurance, we can think of as a muscle's resistance to fatigue. How does that vary from something like aerobic capacity, for example, of that muscle fiber versus the strength or maximum strength of that muscle fiber? Well, it's kind of depends on how you personally define it. You could use a test like a 60% one rep max to failure. How many reps can you do at 60%? You could consider that a test of muscular endurance. You could consider something like how fast does your muscle have experienced local fatigue during a mile. You could call that muscular endurance. It's kind of a poorly defined concept to begin with compared to oxidative capacity or compared to maximal strength. But what I would argue is that it's not really its own trainable quality. I consider it an emergent property or an emergent quality arising from maximal strength and oxidative capacity. So, for example, if we raise the maximal strength of a muscle and we raise the aerobic capacity of the muscle, the ability for that muscle to perform in higher repetition work or in more sustained, fatiguing work is going to improve as well. We actually have pretty good studies on this looking at squat performance. For example, looking at how many times can people squat a light weight. One group trained with the light weight with the goal to do muscular endurance training to get better at squatting a light weight a lot of times. Another group just worked on improving their one rep max, and then they tested to see how well they can squat that lighter weight. What we generally find in studies like that is that both groups get better at squatting lightweight similarly well. The difference is that the 1 rep max group also gets stronger. The muscular endurance group, or the group that just squats lightweight for high reps, they get better at squatting lightweight for high reps, but they don't really improve their 1 rep max strength very much. So what we often see here is that muscular endurance training can be effective from a specificity perspective, trains your skill, your pacing, your tolerance for the burn, that kind of thing. But if we can improve those qualities just as much just by raising your ceiling and raising your maximal strength, to me, that kind of calls into question the value of dedicated muscular endurance work compared to just doing the maximal strength work and doing some of the supportive aerobic capacity work. There's not a lot of good evidence that there's any fundamental underlying qualities, um, gene expression, particular proteins. One that's called into question a lot is MCT1 and MCT4, these lactate shuttle proteins. We don't really have a lot of good evidence that any specific muscular endurance training is going to cause an upregulation of those proteins compared to just improving overall mitochondrial capacity through endurance training and just doing traditional heavy strength training as well. When we look at the data as far as running economy goes, there's not really any data that muscular endurance style training or low weight, high repetition work improves running economy or running performance very well. We have tons of data on the heavy strength training that I've been talking a lot about up to this point in this video. But when it comes to doing things like sets of 20, sets of 30, things where you're really feeling the burn, we don't see that same benefit to tendon stiffness, running economy, or any of the variables that we really care about, probably because we just see a little bit more interference from that fatigue. If you're getting more sore, more tired, you're going to see a decrease in your training quality when you actually go run. You're probably not going to be able to tolerate as much volume as well, and it could end up backfiring. Oftentimes, when we chase specificity, try to make strength training more specific to running, we end up just getting more overlapping fatigue instead of actually being able to drive some of that unique adaptation that we care about. Now, overall, I'm very much a fan of training heavy, keeping volumes relatively low for endurance athletes. However, I would make a case for some of the higher rep, more fatiguing work in a few very niche circumstances. For example, if your training quality and training volume, as far as running goes, is relatively fixed, for example, if you know I can run 30 miles a week no matter what, I don't have time for more than that, I just simply can't or won't do more than that. If that's the case or situation that you're in, I would argue that more training and more fatigue is probably better, especially if you're training for a very long endurance event. So if I have a weekend warrior type, very time crunched, busy executive training for a 100-mile ultra marathon, and they just don't have time to actually put in that many miles, I might actually want them to accumulate a little bit more fatigue and soreness in the gym. So they're going out and hitting that long run that they have time for with a little bit more pre-fatigue, a little bit more muscle damage going into it. I think that's going to prepare them better for the demands of a 100-mile race than taking that more minimalistic approach to strength training that I would usually recommend. Of course, the best case scenario would be they just have more time and energy available to actually run more distance and put in more miles. But in the real world, that's not always the case. So to be generous, I would say muscular endurance training may have a place for some very time crunched individuals or people who otherwise can't run for a specific reason. For example, if running is currently off the table for you due to a certain knee injury, for example, you might be able to do some muscular endurance work for other muscle groups in the gym to at least give yourself some of that metabolic stimulus that you're currently missing out on. Of course, I would generally recommend low intensity cross training for some of those purposes as well, but just making a charitable case and something for you to think about when determining whether muscular endurance training might be right for you. Some of the best data that we actually have on muscular endurance training comes from the world of cycling, looking at very low RPM, high resistance cycling intervals. So, for example, typical cycling workouts are going to be 80 to 120 RPM, usually pedaling pretty quickly. It's fairly common in the cycling world to do these high resistance or high torque intervals where they'll crank the resistance up and then pedal really hard and slow at like 30 to 40 RPM. And then that essentially is designed to improve their muscular endurance, specifically the oxidative capacity of some of those higher twitch muscle fibers. What we generally see is that the research is not that compelling or convincing. These workouts tend to be pretty popular out of tradition. People have been doing them for a long time, but when tested directly in the research, they don't seem to be all of that special. And when we compare very short duration versions of this, like very high intensity, 15-second high resistance bike sprints versus longer, low RPM, like 3, 4, 5 minute intervals. The ones that resemble more just strength training, those 15-second, 10-second, very hard intervals tend to improve performance better than those longer, more endurance focused ones anyway. My take on that is that really they're just getting closer and closer to actual strength training. And I would rather see them just dedicate that time and energy to actual strength work in the gym. Now, in the case of cycling, something slightly different going on there is the cycling is concentric only. So they're removing some of that eccentric demand, some of the things that could be contributing to muscle damage and fatigue. So in the case of cycling, that high resistance concentric only work is pretty effective, specific strength training that's not going to cause a lot of fatigue. So I could see that being a pretty good use of time for cycling specifically. What would that look like for runners? Well, you could do something like heavy sled work, heavy bike sprints against low resistance for strength training. You could also do more concentric strength training options like I've talked about in this video, box squats, for example, things like that where there's not as much of an eccentric component. Any sort of strength training like that, I think, is going to give you the benefits of strength training with a little bit reduced fatigue. In no case would I recommend trying to take that up to the level of muscular endurance training with those 3 to 5 minute intervals, sets of 20 to 30 in the gym. Just wouldn't do that in any case, except maybe some of those very niche circumstances I mentioned earlier. There's two examples of kind of muscular endurance work that I do see as pretty popular options in the running community right now. So I want to talk about those a little bit more specifically. One is these weighted incline hikes that I see a lot of trail runners doing. So instead of just going out and logging miles, they're hopping on an incline treadmill with a weight vest and doing long continuous hikes. That I think is a little bit different than muscular endurance training in the context of the gym. And I think it's generally still long duration enough and lightweight enough that it's really just a slightly different endurance training modality rather than muscular endurance specific. I think when we start getting into added loads and inclines, we're changing body position, posture enough that it's just different enough from running. The loading patterns are slightly different from regular running that it's kind of in that cross training category, but I don't think that the loads or forces are high enough for it to really fall under the category of muscular endurance. So while some people talk about it as muscular endurance work, to me, I just view it as cross training, and it's good additional aerobic volume that you could do if you can't otherwise run more miles. The other thing that I see people doing is jump rope training and higher volume, kind of lower intensity plyometric work. We talked about plyometric work quite a bit already. Overall, I think that it's something that should be done at high intensity and relatively low volumes, but that doesn't mean that everyone is ready for a very difficult 5x5. Gradually introducing exposure to the rhythm and skill of plyometric training with some higher rep work, doing a couple minutes worth of jump rope, I think is a great place to get started and is going to give you a good foundation from which to explore some higher intensity plyometrics down the road. Even still, I think it's better than not doing any plyometrics at all. So if you're considering adding something like jump rope training to your program, I think it's probably a good idea, but I would still generally favor getting into some of those higher intensity exposures like hill work, sprint work, single leg hops and bounds, single leg pogo hops, and those sorts of things. But a little bit of jump rope probably is not going to hurt. And at the very least would be a good warm up prior to some of those higher intensity plyos. So far, everything in this video has been about strength training and plyometric training for running performance. In other words, how can I improve my running economy and how can I run faster? But I know a lot of people are interested in strength and plyometric training from an injury prevention perspective. So we're going to spend the next couple minutes talking about the research on injury prevention and what you can do in the gym to hopefully not get hurt. When it comes to managing specific running related injuries, the research on how to prevent them and how to cure them is a little bit fuzzier than you would expect. Now, in certain cases like Achilles tendinopathy and patellar tendinopathy, we obviously want to drive mechanical tension through those tissues. However, when it comes to strength training to prevent injury, there's a couple of things that we have to think about. The main is the distinction between improving the capacity of a specific tissue and improving the capacity of the system as a whole and its ability to share and distribute the load across more tissue. For example, say we're dealing with an isolated knee issue like a patellar tendinopathy, a runner's knee, a jumper's knee. We have two main options or ways that we can think about that. We can A, just try to make the knee better so that it can handle the demands that you're placing on the knee. The other idea is to make the hips stronger, make the hamstring stronger, make everything else stronger so that all the other muscle groups can help share the load and reduce the demand on the knee itself. Those two strategies are both promising options. And when we look at the research on specific running injuries, we often see that no specific exercise really works better than another because lots of different exercises can work for the same issue in different ways. For example, hip strengthening might spare the knee, knee strengthening might give the knee more capacity to handle larger stresses. So, what we see in the research when we compare hip exercises versus quad exercises for knee pain, we might see that both work, and it's hard to know what actually works better and for who. What is clear though is that just training in general, just doing any training whatsoever, is generally a good idea and generally reduces injury incidence to some degree. But when it comes to very specific exercises, saying this exercise is how you prevent this injury, we just can't really say that because injury is complicated. Sometimes it's because one muscle or one joint needs to get a little bit stronger. Sometimes it's because we need to be better about sharing the load. And it's usually a combination of both of those factors and a million other things too. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that exercise selection doesn't matter at all from an injury prevention or symptom management perspective. If you're currently dealing with some sort of injury or some sort of flare up, there's probably going to be certain exercises that you want to do, certain exercises that you don't want to do or want to manage the load on to work around that symptom. But when it comes to preventing running related injuries overall, the point is that you have to be doing things in the gym that prepare you for the demands of running. And that's just what good strength training is. It's not prehab exercises. There's not special exercises, special PT exercises that you need to do to prevent running related injuries. You just need good general strength training that prepares you for the demands of running. And that's everything that we've talked about up to this point. Are you training your quads and your hamstrings and your glutes? Are you getting mechanical tension through those key areas like the Achilles, patellar, glute, and hamstring tendon? If you're doing those things, if you're lifting heavy enough to stimulate the tendon, stimulate bone growth, if you're doing those things, that is injury prevention for running. There's no magic exercise. You don't need to be doing a prehab routine. You need to be strength training and you need to be training hard. Of course, if you get into a situation where you have an injury and you're managing pain, there's going to be strategies that you can implement with a PT, with a physical therapist that might help you get through that, minimize pain. That's not what this video is about, but the main point of this video is to say that if you are doing the performance training that we've talked about up to this point, that is the injury prevention training too. There's really no distinction to be made there. Overall, I would say that the category of prehab exercises that runners do is probably the most overrated component of strength training for runners. Like I mentioned earlier, performance training is injury prevention training. And if you are doing kind of low load, overly complex, PT-esque rehab or prehab exercises, and you're doing that to prevent an injury that you don't currently have, to me, you have all of it backwards. Training is about exceeding the demands of running, meeting yourself where you're currently at, and working to improve your capabilities. It's not about training like you already have an injury. Training like you already have an injury is not a good way to try to prevent one. So when it comes to things like overly complex balance drills, low load band exercises, low level warm ups, glute activation drills, all of those sorts of things that a lot of runners will spend time on either before a running workout or as part of their gym session, those things are all significantly overrated. Again, to be clear, if you do have an injury, some lower load exercises might be necessary from a tolerance or pain standpoint, but don't make the mistake of training like you're injured if you aren't. That's not how you're going to prevent those injuries. You're going to prevent injuries from just continuing to push the limits, training for performance, and managing your overall training load responsibly. When it comes to injury prevention for runners, one area that a lot of people spend a lot of time and attention on is the shin or the tibia. They worry about shin splints and they worry about how to train to prevent shin splints. Now, aside from the obvious, like managing your overall training load, training intensity, some exercises may have a role to play here. specifically just having general plantar flexion or calf strength, like we spent so much time in this video talking about already, is definitely important there. What it probably is not very important that a lot of people think is important is the strength of the anterior tib. A lot of people will do those tibialis raises thinking that it's going to prevent shin splints. And for a distance runner, simply is not going to be the case. There's not a lot of good evidence to support that's going to be helpful with anything. One of the main reasons for that is that the tibialis muscle is not very active in distance running compared to uh, short deceleration. You know, if you have to put your foot way out in front of you, stop on a dime, if you're playing basketball and have to make a quick step, there's going to be some load on the tibia doing an activity like that, but not so much in a normal gait cycle of long duration running. In fact, we have some case studies. There was an individual who was born without a tibialis muscle who went on to be a very successful marathon runner. Just more evidence that tibialis is not very significant as far as distance running performance goes. From a shin splint perspective, just don't run too much or too fast too soon. Make sure you're training your calves and doing some of the other performance training that we've talked about in this video. But as far as tibialis raises go, you can probably skip them. Now, just because something doesn't directly improve your running performance doesn't mean that you can't do it as a runner. I think that we're often very quick to forget that runners are people too, and you want to be a strong, healthy, robust human, not just be so laser focused on running performance that you forget about all the other ways that strength training can improve your quality of life. So, there's a couple of things that I want to share with you today that I think is worth including in your program as a runner, even though it doesn't directly improve running performance, and I can't make an argument for that. I still think it's worth including at least a very small dose of it, and I don't think it's going to significantly affect your running performance for better or for worse. The first bit of extra credit for runners is upper body training in general. Now, runners will be hesitant to do upper body training because they don't want to carry around a lot of extra weight that might slow them down. The main thing that I would have to say is that you don't have to do very much or really have a lot of added mass at all to experience a lot of the benefits that upper body training can have on your overall quality of life and longevity in the space. Now, a little bit of additional muscle mass, say a pound or two from upper body training, could easily be offset by reduced fat mass if that training just leads to overall recomposition. A lot of runners are not particularly lean in their upper body, they carry some additional fat mass. And if just doing more strength training, including some strength training for the upper body, allows you to recomp a pound or two of that, have a tiny bit more muscle mass, but just be a little bit leaner overall, you're not really adding an additional weight cost. You're just approaching a healthier, more athletic body composition in general. I think that's generally going to be fine. And if you're not eating a significant calorie surplus, you're not going to be able to gain the excess weight that you're talking about. Just keep your overall calories in check, add a small amount of upper body training, and you're probably going to be fine. I think it's worth it for a couple of main reasons. First, we talked about earlier how training heavy is important for bone density, and you want to have bone density in your upper body as well for health throughout your entire life. By the time you get to your 60s or 70s or 80s, you don't want to have low bone density in your wrists and shoulders and spine and all of the areas that you're going to be able to stimulate via training your upper body with a very small minimum effective dose. As little as 1 or 2 sets, 5, 6 reps of some upper body exercises is going to keep those bones a little bit healthier. And if, again, like I said earlier, if your total calories are managed, it's not really going to add a lot of additional muscle mass or total mass that you have to carry around. In terms of quality of life, you also just want to have good range of motion and mobility in your upper body as well. What good is being able to run fast if you don't have full overhead range of motion or your pecs are super tight, shoulders super tight? It just doesn't feel good. And a very small amount of upper body training through a full range of motion is going to be great to preserve that mobility and just feel a little bit better. Again, it doesn't have to be a lot, but if you are a runner doing a very minimal amount of upper body strength training, I would encourage you to think about prioritizing a full range of motion, getting that full stretch on a little bit of training that you're doing, just to preserve as much mobility as you can as efficiently as possible. Speaking of mobility, you don't have to have great range of motion in your lower body to be a good runner. In fact, a lot of the best runners in the world have very tight hamstrings and can't touch their toes. But that doesn't mean that you can't pursue mobility gains and be a good runner too. I think it's one of the things that most runners ignore because it's not strictly necessary, but it can start to affect your quality of life and your ability to engage in other activities in a way that might not feel so great. I think a lot of people needlessly fear mobility because they know that so many great runners are not the most mobile. They think that there is a cause and effect there, and they think that if they improve their mobility, they might get worse at running, and that's simply not the case. Most of the research that we have on mobility and running performance is more just an association, generally finding that people with longer legs, proportions that don't favor great mobility performance, those people tend to be more efficient runners. It doesn't mean that if you engage in a mobility intervention or a stretching program, that your running performance is going to get a lot worse. Now, I don't think that you have to stretch to prevent injury or anything like that, but I do think that just training to be able to touch your toes, do some activities like that is going to be complementary to your running. You're just going to feel like a better, more robust, capable human. The last thing that you might want to think about as a runner that may or may not have a huge impact on your performance is respiratory training. It's kind of a wild card entry here. Just didn't want to finish this video without at least making a call out to training the diaphragm and training your inspiratory muscles. There is some data to suggest that training the muscles of inspiration, so training to take a more forceful and complete inhale, may improve running economy, running performance a small degree. It's pretty inconsistent, and it's actually a very odd area where the effect seems to be more robust in more advanced athletes compared to beginners. Most training interventions, when we look at how strength training, plyometric training, any sort of intervention, or even a supplement, when we look at how those things impact beginners versus advanced runners, we almost always see larger effects with beginners with diminishing returns in more advanced athletes. Training the inspiratory muscles, or IMT training, is one example where it doesn't seem to matter much for beginners, but some advanced athletes might benefit from it a little bit. If it's something that you're curious about giving a shot, there are inspiratory muscle trainers that you can buy, but I think they're overrated and they're just a pain in the butt to clean. You can just do simple pursed lip inhales. So, for example, trying to keep my lips very tight as if I'm sucking in through a straw. Just provide yourself enough resistance that you can barely breathe in and you're just kind of fighting against that resistance. You could even use a straw or something if you wanted to. Doing about 30 breaths per day is generally the most studied intervention or protocol out there. You could throw something like that into a warm up or a cool down from, as part of your normal gym session. Throw in some of those breaths, see how you feel. I am planning on doing some more experimenting, collecting some data with IMT training, making a whole video on it at a later date. But because that is technically a muscle that you could train in the gym, wanted to make a special mention for that IMT training in this video. If there's one thing to me that stands out about how the best runners in the world strength train, it's the variety. There is no one size fits all approach. There are no best exercises. There's simply overarching principles that matter. But as far as the exact doses, the exact number of reps, the exact number of sets, the best exercise for this muscle group or the best exercise for that muscle group, it just doesn't matter. As long as you're getting some mechanical tension through the key areas that we talked about, doing some form of strength training, getting some higher intensity impacts through either plyos, sprint training, or regular incorporation of strides in your program, you're going to get the vast majority of the benefits that strength training has to offer you. Don't overcomplicate it. Don't try to make things too running specific. Don't allocate too much time and energy on it either. Just do the basics well and consistently, and you're going to be on your way to improving your running performance, running economy, preventing injury, and feeling like a stronger, more robust human being. That's all I have for you guys this week. If you're interested to see how I program for runners, check out some of my running programs. I have them linked in the description below. See you next time.